In this video, I'm going to teach you how to create a new family, how to understand that family environment, and how to use work planes to create the geometry that you need. To begin, let's go ahead and open up a new project. The project you're looking at is the temple that I've imported from SketchUp, and I've started modeling some of the walls. But what we need to create a new family is to go up here to File, New. We're accustomed to opening a new project, but this time we want to open a new family. Now, each one of these is a template that you can use in family creating. There's really only a couple that I ever use. Generic model is a pretty good one, but my favorite generic model, face-based. This is the one that I use probably 99% of the time. And the reason why is that as soon as you open it, there's already a host in here. And I'll go into 3D so you can see what this host looks like. It's more or less a surface that you can create something on. And after you've created it, it will show up in your next project on whatever you want to be the active host. Take, for example, a simple box like this. This box is attached to the host, and the back of the box will continue to be the back of this object when I load it into my next project. And instead of being attached to this host, it'll attach itself to any surface that I can find within my project. This shape is still very fluid, so I can change it, do whatever I want, and then when I'm ready, I'll load it into my project. And when I'm ready to place it, I'll go to Architecture Component. That's where all the families that you create should show up. And you can see that instead of that little host that used to be there, it's being replaced by these wall surfaces. If I go down here to the floor, it's being replaced by a floor surface or an edge, or anything that it can find becomes the new host. If I go back and let's say that I make a change to this shape, a drastic one to make it obvious, I can then load it into my project one more time, and every instance of that shape that was placed previously gets updated with the new version. Now, this also means that it's very important when you're done modifying a shape that you always give it a name. It's by default it's going to be family 1, 2, 3, or 4, or whatever, but you always want to go File, Save As, save it as a family, name it something wherever you want it to be saved, and then when you load it in and you go back into that project, you go to your component drop down and it will be named according to whatever the object actually is. One of the confusing things about working in a family environment is that your host is down on the floor. So in order to look at it and create on it, you actually need to go to the reference level. And sometimes that kind of seems weird because you're using the reference level and you might think of this as a wall that's vertical, but it's down on the floor. That gets a little bit confusing. Over time, you start to understand that this has any orientation once it's loaded into a project. Here, it's always on the floor, but in the project, it's not a floor anymore. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, let's first talk about work planes, because work planes is pretty much where all the creation happens. And in a family environment, your menu is different. You don't have an architecture tab. Instead, you have a create tab. And these are all the form generators. This is everything you need to create any shape that's allowed inside this environment. The most popular and the easiest by far is the extrusion. And that's probably the only one that I'm going to deal with in this video. Now, going back to 3D, you would assume that the bottom, or the host, is the work plane. So what does that mean? If I were to do an extrusion, it means that any lines that I draw, and they're just outlines, they have to be attached to that work plane. And they don't have to stay on your host, but they're always in the same plane. I can start out here, I can put more than one in here, I can use any other shape, but they're always going to be directly on that plane. And then an extrusion just means I take that shape and I give it length. And the length is included over here in your properties. It has an extrusion start and an extrusion end. If I leave this at 0 and this at 1, I'll have just a 1 foot object. And if you want to change the top, you can either go over here and modify your properties, Or you can simply grab the arrow here and you can see that number is going to grow. If you want to change the bottom, you adjust the extrusion start. And once again, I can pull that away, or I can just enter in a number. If I want this to look a little bit more clean, I'll put numbers in. Okay, those two numbers together are what we consider to be the depth. So if I'm 5 feet high at the end, minus 1 foot at the bottom, my depth is 4 feet. So you can also control it over here. I can say I want it to be a 6-foot object, and these numbers will have adjusted. Okay, now again, let's get back to this work plane idea, because this is great when I want something to be extruded out from my host. But what if that's not adequate for whatever it is that I'm trying to build? Well, you can always go back to the Create tab and show where your work plane is at. You just click on Show, and it tells you this is the active work plane. There are other views in here. So, for example, if I go to the right-hand side, now what's the active work plane? It's probably not going to be down here at the bottom anymore like it was in 3D. In fact, let's open both of these up together. And the reason being, a work plane is pretty much a big piece of paper. It's like an infinite piece of paper. That's how you can think of it. So if this is my active work plane and I'm going to draw on that paper, and then I go over here to the right-hand side, you can see there's no way to draw on that paper. In fact, this reference level, that represents the paper. It's just a simple line when I look at it from over here. And how's that possible? Well, if you think of it as this piece of paper turned flat, it becomes a line. That's all it is. And so over here, there's my reference level. I'm not able to draw on that plane anymore. Well, what if I tried to create an extrusion? What would happen? Let's go to Create, Extrusion. I've got all my shapes, my shape tools here. Let's try another rectangle. And it's letting me draw. It's not on that paper anymore. It must be somewhere else. Let's give it like a 5-foot extrusion, and then in 3D you can see, whoa, where did it begin? It looks like it's right in the center of that host. Which way will it go? Let's accept this and find out. It came out towards the right. Okay, if we go back into the reference level view, we should be able to explain what just happened. If you ignore all these shapes and the host, we're left with, in fact, I'm just going to hide all these. We're left with two lines, and they're dashed lines. These are called reference planes. They have a name, and they are more or less one of those pieces of paper. They're planes that you can work on. And in this case, they just look like lines because we've turned that piece of paper on edge, and we're just looking at the edge. Let's go over here and see if we can adjust the work plane so that it would reflect one of these two lines. Now, this is the one that we just drew on. Let's see if we can turn that one on. Center, left, right. Over here in my 3D, I'm going to change the active work plane. Let me adjust this. By going to Create, and I'm going to set the work plane to something other than what it already is. Set work plane. We've got a list here. Let's go find the center, left, right. That's the one we said we were drawing on. And then click OK. And sure enough, there's that piece of paper. It's represented by this line. Looks like that. Let's unhide everything so you can really see that relationship. And in 3D, I'm able to rotate it so that I can see it. But now, once again, I can create any shape that I want for an extrusion, and it starts right here. There it is. And over here, that shape, well, it should have appeared, unless it's out of my view range. I suppose it's just too high. Let's drop it down and see if it will eventually show up. Ah, there it is. It showed up. It's still on the work plane, even though it's farther out than the extension of that line. And that line could extend. It can go forth and back from that grip, but that's not really necessary. You'll have to take my word for it. It can. It's pinned. It's pinned. So normally you could extend those if you need to, but you typically don't. You can just see the alignment. Okay, so back over here, we've got two work planes, so of course I could set it in the other direction. And if I wanted to draw on any one of these work planes, I would just go into a view that looks at the piece of paper, if you will. So if I go to the front view, here's the front view now, and that means we would be drawing on this one because now that's got to be the active work plane in this view. If you don't know what the active work plane is, you can always go back here, set work plane, and you can see this is the active one. It's called reference plane center front back. Okay, there are also a couple other options in here, like pick a plane or pick a line and use the work plane it was sketched in. I don't really use that one, but I do use pick a plane quite a lot. And even though you can access it from here, you can simply just pick a plane and then select OK, and it will take you back into this environment where you can pick a plane. I typically go to it or access that tool from here. It's a little bit faster and simpler. Pick a plane, same thing. So let's go back into 3D. This is the active plane once again in this view. I guess that's another important thing to point out. Every view can have its own active work plane. But if I want to change it here without going to pick a plane or set work plane, instead I choose pick a plane, and now I'm still not allowed to choose one of these reference planes just because I can't see them over here, but I'm actually allowed in this case to pick a plane based on a surface that I've already created. Now, it wouldn't allow me to do this curved surface because that's not a piece of paper. You can't think of that as a piece of paper, but all these other straight surfaces you can. And so I could say that's going to be, let's do this one, the top. That's my new work plane. And as long as show is active, I'll be able to see it. If I ever want to turn it off, sometimes it gets in the way, I can just turn it off. But now there's my work plane. If it's too small for my liking, I'll just extend it, and I can start creating anything that I want to now on that work plane as opposed to the reference plane that we began with down here. As a matter of fact, if I go back to the reference level, I now have the ability even here to change the active work plane. Let's see what it's set to. Set work plane. It's still set to reference level. And now it looks like it's recognizing the extrusion that I set it to over here, and I could just pick extrusion. And now it's up higher in both my reference level and 3D. And we can prove that just by drawing yet another shape. You can see it started the shape up here in the air. And I'll extrude that, and there we go. Okay, now that also means that sometimes it's not so convenient to just go pick the top of a surface, or maybe it's even impossible. This also means then that if this line can be a reference plane, we ought to be able to create more of those. So if I go to the right, I could come up here, create, set up my own reference plane, and just simply draw that. And you can see here that it wants me to click to give that a name. So I'll just name this way up high. And now if I go over here to 3D, create, let's set the work plane. I can choose the option for way up high. Click OK, and that lifts it way up high. So now I've got all these options to tell Revit where do I want to start creating. And you just have to make sure and remember that the only way to create is to be able to draw a shape on top of the reference plane. And that reference plane can pretty much be in any orientation that you want or need. It's also important to note that once I've created any one of these shapes, they become a form that's still editable. So when I did this one, I actually drew two lines, and therefore they are connected. If I double click on them or edit the extrusion, it goes back into the sketch that I originally created for that form, and I can continue to add to that form. And anything that I add here is going to remain connected. In other words, raising them up, raising one of them will raise all of them. Notice it's raising the shape over on the right. That's because there's a work plane, and this is attached to the work plane that's at the top of one of these shapes. And some of these I can maneuver independently or adjust independently. But the top and the bottom, the height, that's all going to move together like that. Okay, and then if I want to edit any of the others, again, I just double click on it. I can go back into any other view and see what its shape is and adjust it there. And then when I'm done, I just click accept. And then, of course, some of these other shapes can also be used. I'll explain some of those in other videos. But for right now, the last thing that we need to do is maybe clean this up just a little bit. Yeah, let's just delete that out and we'll be left with one little shape. And I want to point out the last thing, which is that the host is always the host. So no matter how many reference planes you create or adjust or show or set, the host is always going to be the host down here. Which means when I insert this, this will be the back of all of these forms. No matter how many combinations of forms there are, this area here will be the back of all those forms, and it will also be the insertion point. These original crosshairs form the exact insertion point, right where they touch. Well, whenever I click to place this object, my cursor will be at the back of the object right here in the center of it. And if I offset it, my cursor would still be here when I place it. I'm no longer in the center of the object, but this is always the insertion point. Okay, let's test it. I'm going to do it offset like this. I'm going to hit load into project. And just a side note, normally before you load it into project, you want to go File, Save. And that's how you can give this family a name. Load into project. Temple import is the name of my project. Okay, I'm going to overwrite the existing. It should just pop up and allow you to start placing it, but if it doesn't, you have to go to place a component, and it's this component drop down or component list. And you can see the insertion point is at the back of the object. You can notice here that it's not letting me place it on these towers, and that's because those are SketchUp towers. It's only letting me attach to anything that was modeled in Revit. And just like we thought, the insertion point is working, and there's the back of the object. Okay, that's Families 101. That's how they work, and this opens the door to all kinds of potential, so make sure you understand the environment, the tools, the work plane, and the host.